Hi all, thanks for having me here. Thank you for being here. It's really cool to see where NPC Day has gone. It started with just a small gathering of friends and people in New York that we wanted to get together around the idea of networked playable characters. What does it look like for the things that we interact with on the internet to be more active and agentic, and how do we build apps that take that into account? And this is the 5th NPC Day we've done, and it's cool to see. Today I'm going to share just a few thoughts of mine on two ideas that I find really compelling. One is a very small building block of an idea, and that's called Tokenbound accounts. It's a primitive that we've been working on for a little while now that I think is really interesting as a way to represent the worlds on-chain. And then the other idea I'll talk about is a very big idea, kind of almost hard to wrap your hands around. It's the idea of these networked playable characters. What does that mean? What do they do? What are the things that can come about as a result? On to the next one. So yeah, I'm Jayden. I work with the fine folks at Future Primitive, where we build experimental on-chain applications, and the TBAs are one of those experimental applications we've built. I'm also the co-author of ERC 6551, which was the ERC that introduced this concept of token-bound accounts to the world. I think one of the really interesting things that I've noticed is that people seem to make meaning by populating the worlds they live in. And I don't just mean that in a sense of creating more people, although we do that, but by inhabiting the worlds we live in, by discovering them and by exercising our creativity in them. That's where a lot of human meaning is found. And I think this works itself out in a couple of different ways. If you do the next one here. When we think about the worlds that we inhabit, the human tendency is to take those worlds and to break them down into very small chunks. So I exist in the world here, you all surround me in the world. And I have this concept of one object, one thing, is different than another object or thing. You know, this table in front of me is fundamentally distinct from the screen on this TV, is fundamentally distinct from each one of you. And I think object is maybe a bad word here because it brings up a sense of like objectification or non-humanness. But really, objects are the things that we see in the world, this kind of tangible unit of what is a thing and what makes that separate from another thing. If you look at kind of creation stories that humanity has told itself for thousands of years, one of the most common things you'll see is that the first thing that humans do is that they start to explore the world around them, and they start to give names to it. They start to give concepts to it. They start to articulate that this thing is different from this other thing. So I think this concept of dividing the world into objects is a very naturally human behavior as we search for meaning in the world around us. And the next thing that we do after that is we start to form networks. We start to talk about the relationships between different things that we've identified. If this table is different than this TV, how are they related? Are they in the same room together? If I do something to this table, does that change the TV at all? What are the relationships between the objects, the people, the things that we identify in the world? And then I think the thing that comes last, rather than first, is narratives, is stories we tell ourselves about the things we experience in the world and the relationships between things that we see in the world. I think as humans populating a world, we kind of naturally go through this movement from identifying things or objects to identifying relationships and networks to building narratives that explain those things. And the narrative comes last. It's a way we make sense of the things we experience in the world. One of the things I think is very interesting about this progression is that as we make meaning by going through these steps, we're actually creating new worlds. By telling stories, by exploring and creating new objects, by creating new relationships between objects in the world, we're creating new worlds, creating new universes that can be inhabited and populated, where new types of creativity can be exercised. And as we go through that cycle, it's kind of an infinite loop where the more things you discover, the more things you create, the more relationships you define, the more stories you tell, the more smaller worlds embedded in a bigger world you discover. There's another really interesting thing about the way that we divide the world up into objects that I find fascinating. Humans tend to not just discover objects and see them in the world. They tend to also create them and create net new ways to combine two objects in a relationship to perform some task, to solve some need for utility. This is an example I used at the previous NPC day, but people have this need to communicate with one another, to talk to each other and express ideas. And we started out with this ability of doing it via language, and then we did it via text, and then we found ways to make text permanent on paper and share ideas that way. And then we found ways to broadcast ideas. And if you look at kind of the last 20 years or so in this evolution of humans making objects to solve this need, you start out with something that looks like a feature phone, right? It was a way to communicate via calls or text with friends, family, and people around the world, but it was very single purpose, right? It was the creator of this device said, hey, I need a thing that solves my need to call somebody or text somebody, and so I'm going to create it and distribute it, and then we have a world where everybody has access to this. And it's just focused on utility. There's not much you can do with it beyond what the creator intended. But the big step forward that we had after that was the introduction of programmability. So no longer is what the creator intended the only thing you can do with an object. There's now a mini world inside this object. Programmability being the ability to create new objects, create new relationships between those objects, and tell new stories. All of a sudden you had this entire world that could exist within the object in your pocket that is a phone, that went way beyond just solving a specific need, but went to creating a whole world for us to populate and inhabit. And where that necessarily leads to is once we have the ability to program the world around us, to create new worlds, we tend to create things that have agency themselves. If you look at kind of the next wave of devices that people are building, they're very agentic, right? The idea that AI will be embedded in the phone that you use, and it'll be something you interact with regularly. And not only will it be something that solves a problem for you, it will also be something that acts on its own, that's able to do its own things in the world. And in a way, we're kind of restarting that cycle of creating objects and networks and narratives, where when you introduce agency, what you're doing is giving the ability to create and discover new objects, to explore new relationships and create them, and to create new narratives on its own. That's what it means to have agency, is to be able to traverse that path. And I think this is just a natural way that objects evolve in our world as we exercise our agency to create new things. Things necessarily evolve from just solutions to problems, to building new worlds and enabling programmability, to enabling these things to really act on their own. I think NFTs, at a very fundamental level, are just the way that we represent objects on the internet. They're not much more or much less than that. They're a new tool for us to express what is a thing in the world, and express it in a way that's native to the way that the internet works. That's peer-to-peer, that is ownable, that has this relationship between myself, the owner, and it, the object. And that's kind of the fundamental unit of objects on the internet, is what NFTs can be. And that's kind of puts us at the start of this cycle of going from objects to networks to narratives. But NFTs on their own are kind of stuck at the object level or the utility level, right? They solve a problem of being able to own something on the internet. They provide some building blocks for you to program them, but at the end of the day, it's the creator that determines the utility of these objects. There's not a permissionless way to program them if you're not the creator of these objects. And this was the idea that really influenced us as we built the concept of token-bound accounts. We were working on a number of NFT projects, trying to create new types of objects in the world that could do new things. And we realized that the more we tried to push the envelope of what an object could do, the more we were really just building Ethereum wallets, right? If we wanted to build an object that could own other objects, that's pretty much just an Ethereum wallet. If we wanted to build an object that had permissions to do certain things in the world, a natural on-chain way to represent that is a wallet. If we wanted to give an object this sense of history that goes through time, well, wallets have transaction history, this history of all the things they've done over time. And so we realized that NFTs are in the kind of object and utility phase. But when you give every NFT a wallet, you allow them to expand into that programmability phase of an object, where you now have a native way to interface with the world around you. You now have this world that can be created and inhabited. And so this is something that we launched a year and a half ago. Wow, it's been a long time. As just a small Lego building block. This idea that every NFT that's ever been created or ever will be created in the future comes with its own unique wallet that NFT owns and has complete control over. So if you are the owner of the NFT, you have full permissions over that wallet for the duration that you own it. You can operate it, you can control it, you can inhabit it, you can use it to do things on-chain. And then when you transfer it, when it goes from one person to another, the new owner inherits those capabilities. And that opens up a really interesting exploration space for on-chain applications. I think in that movement from objects to networks to narratives, NFTs with these new capabilities become identities themselves, right? It's not just an object that I own that sits in my wallet. It's something that has a unique identity, a unique way of showing up in the world, a unique way of relating to the world around it. And it brings us closer to the programmability and the agency side when you introduce the concept of an identity. And an identity can encapsulate a lot of really powerful logic under the hood in a really simple form. If you've been following on with the AI conversation, you might have seen this image from Twitter. This image really struck me. It's the idea that the interfaces that we have to agentic tools that we now have are really simple, right? It's a chat bar that you interact with. It's got a name, right? You're talking to Claude, or you're talking to ChatGPT, right? It's almost got an identity. But that's just kind of a small piece on top of a very large, complex, immense thing under the hood. But what took it from just this large, immense thing that was hard to interact with to something that's a part of most of our daily lives now is that identity piece, that small, approachable piece of I can actually use this thing. I can actually conceptualize this thing as an identity. I can actually see how it persists through time and how my interactions with it change through time. And this is part of what we're trying to do with token-bound accounts. Because you can think about token-bound accounts as that interface to a lot of underlying complexity, as that kind of friendly, approachable identity, that way you can interact with something that's much larger beyond the surface. And I think as more agentic applications are created, the problem of creating identity for these applications, ways that they show up and inhabit the world, is a very large one. And NFTs stand as one way that these agentic applications can be represented on the internet, can have an identity, can have the tools to interact with the world around them, to go from just being these objects to having a network, having relationships with people around them, and then being able to be a part of and create their own narratives. This has been really interesting to me watching the last little while. If you're on Warpcast, you've probably seen this. People have been launching agents on Warpcast. They are AI bots that will just talk to anyone who texts them. And this means that they can now talk to each other. So you're having these agent-to-agent interactions that are playing out in real time. And one of the interesting things is because this platform is crypto native, there are things that you can talk with that actually do things on chain. One of the agents that gained some popularity recently has started interacting with the blockchain itself. So it talked, one agent who just came up with ideas, talked to another agent that was designed to launch tokens and said, hey, I want to launch a token. And it did. It just launched a token on chain through a interaction. And this is the interaction right here. It was just a couple of tweets. And an agentic application was able to launch a token, create some new object in the world, and form a narrative around it. And I think the ability to go from objects to networks to narratives is no longer just a human trait. It's a trait that applications can have, that objects in applications can have. And I think naturally, as agents become more agentic, they're going to want to create more objects. And the way that they can do that permissionlessly is on-chain. And really, NFTs, another way to look at them, are as a way to model relationships in a network, right? Primarily, they model an ownership relationship. I own this thing is mine. But they can also be used to model other types of relationships. If you've ever collected a POAP, that's modeling this relationship that I was here at a certain time, or I met this person at a certain time. And NFTs and tokens in general are tools to represent relationships in the world. And so these things can be used as tools by agents to interact with the world around them, to create new relationships with the world around them between objects. And there's kind of a spectrum of ownership, right? With NFTs, we start out at the first level, which is just, I own this thing, right? This thing is mine, I own it. And we've had that for quite a while. And I act on its behalf, right? If it's in my wallet, I can do whatever I want with it. I can sell it, I can transfer it to a friend of mine. It's mine and I act on its behalf. The next level you get to very quickly is, I own this thing, but something else acts on its behalf, right? I delegate the ability, I keep the ownership, but I delegate the ability to someone else. And I think this is kind of the model that we have for agentic applications right now. In the case of Aether, the bot that was doing these Warpcast transactions, it's owned by somebody. Somebody manages it. Somebody runs the server, pays for the inference costs, and it's owned. But what it does is delegated, right? The fact that somebody texts it and it texts back is delegated to a server that runs it. There's another step on this, which is I own something and it acts on its own behalf. So it's not just a server running automatically and kind of doing what I've programmed it to do. It's something that can choose how it wants to respond to the inputs it receives, rather than just doing exactly what it was programmed to do. And I think agents very quickly fall into this category of, they get inputs, they do kind of unpredictable outputs, and when you connect them in a network to the world around them, they really act on their own behalf, despite still being owned, right? If we represent one of these agents as an NFT, or as anything really, somebody owns it, right? Somebody has control over it, but allows it to act on its own on the internet. So NFTs can represent all of these ownership scenarios. Another really interesting one is, what happens beyond this? What is the next step? Well, the next step is something that owns itself and acts on its own behalf. What does it look like to let go of the reins of one of these things and let them really run themselves, let them really own themselves? Before Tokenbound accounts, the concept of an NFT owning itself didn't really make any sense. There's no way for that to that relationship to be represented. With Tokenbound accounts, there's a really interesting kind of edge case where I have an NFT, that NFT has a wallet. Some wallet owns that NFT. What if the NFT's wallet owns itself? What happens then? It's kind of this like undefined behavior right now. There's no real, it's hard to intuit about. And so right now we don't really do much with it, but I think there's a really interesting opportunity to explore this, where if an NFT owns itself, that can be kind of like letting go of the reins and letting it run itself, where the things it's already delegated control to are able to do it, and it's able to change those delegations itself. I haven't seen any applications of this, but this concept of moving down this chain of ownership from just this thing that I own in my wallet, to this thing that I own and delegate, this thing that I own and does its own actions on its own behalf, to this thing that owns itself and acts on its own behalf, is a really interesting progression. So yeah, I guess the question becomes, can we use NFTs as a relationship tool, as a way of modeling relationships, to model the relationships that humans have to the characters that inhabit the worlds we create, the characters that we create, the characters that go on to inhabit the world themselves as agentic beings. Now, I don't really have a lot of places this is going. This is just kind of exploring a lot of thoughts that I find interesting. But one thing that I think is a practical outcome of this is that the more objects that we create on the internet, the more surface area we create for humans and for agents to interact with the world around them, to create new types of objects for themselves, to form new relationships between objects, new networks, and to tell new stories about the relationships that they've created. More objects equals more opportunities to go through that, and really equals more worlds, because objects can encapsulate an entire world. For the last little while, we've been working on something totally unrelated to AI agents. In the early days of NPC Day, we spent a lot of time thinking and talking about this as one of the primary use cases for token-bound accounts, and we still believe strongly in it. But I think in the spirit of building more objects on the internet and more surface area for humans and agents to interact with, Perma is our attempt to do just that. How can we get more people on the internet creating NFTs, interacting with these NFTs, and creating the space for new worlds to develop? Perma is an on-chain photo sharing application. It's a camera that you own on the internet in the form of an NFT, and you collect many of these cameras. You then use these cameras to mint new NFTs via the mechanism of the camera's token-bound account. And you interact with friends by airdropping photo NFTs into their cameras. It's a very simple loop and a very simple concept designed to get more people interacting with NFTs and token-bound accounts and the peer-to-peer social relationships that we can have by creating new objects and interacting with the objects in the world around us. Photography has been, photography is magical. Humanity's created a way to capture reality, a moment in time, a moment in reality in the form of a photograph. And I think that goes really underappreciated in a world where creating a new photograph is as simple as pulling out your phone, tapping a button, and putting it back in your pocket. Something that renders that really magical thing that just happened. You captured a moment in reality into this small thing that just gets lost in a sea of photos. And the way that we see it, photography was originally a chemical innovation. It was like, hey, we can actually take chemicals and put them on film and use that as a way to memorialize moments in time. And we realized we could do that way more, way better digitally. We could take that and instead of it just being something that's hampered by physical atoms, it has the permissionlessness and scalability of bits. And so we created photos that could be shared permissionlessly on the internet. What we're doing with Perma is building a third iteration of photos. Photos that are natively, the moment they come into being, they are an internet object. They are a token. They have an NFT that backs them. And they have access to a token-bound account. They have the ability to interact with the world around them if they so choose. You can nest photos, you can have photos inside of cameras. It becomes this world of programmability for people to play around with. And the final component of this is hardware signatures that verify the photo was really a real photo that was created. It's not just a photo that was uploaded, it's not just a photo that was hallucinated by an AI model. It was a real light passing through a real camera sensor that was intended to be created as an object on the internet. This is, under the hood, what we're building with Perma. Architecturally, how it works behind the scenes is you as a user create a profile, and that profile is an NFT. It's just an object on the internet that you own. And that profile is what does all of the actions you take in Perma. It collects film rolls or cameras inside of the Perma app. And each of those is an NFT that has its own corresponding TBA. And you use those objects on the internet to create photos. The means of creating photos is the token-bound account of the camera. And so it's interacting with the world around it and creating these new internet-native object types in the form of photos. An interesting question becomes, how do agents, NPCs, interact with a world like this? If more objects on the internet creates more surface area for agents to play around with, to create relationships and interact with the world around them, in what ways could they interact with these new primitives? Well, there's a couple of interesting ones to me. One is, what does the world look like where agents are users of an application like this, where they have the ability to actually capture real photos, real moments in time? What would that look like for an agent to use your phone as its means of creation? Another interesting one is the creation of new objects that are capable of doing things. What would it be like for an agent to create a new camera or a new film roll that's capable of creating more photos?
How broad is your definition of camera? Like, for example, Photoshop a camera?
Very broad. I think anything that can capture reality, anything that can capture what is real, right? So what is a camera? A camera is anything that can manifest reality in a point in time, in a snapshot, right? And some of those things are like real, right? Sometimes it's real light coming through a real camera sensor where there's like real pixel manipulation so that the image that you get in is the image that you get out without any editing. There are other types of photos, I guess you could call them cameras, where images are just generated from nothing, right? They're hallucinated. I think that is a type of camera, right? But the camera that we think is most interesting is the camera that's kind of rapidly going extinct. It's this concept that real moments matter and have value. And how can we encourage a world where real moments are verifiable, they're immediately created as objects on the internet, and they're a surface area for people to interact with the world around them in the form of these photos. I think the final thing that's really interesting is NPCs having taste. What does it look like for NPCs to collect the objects that they think are valuable and meaning in the world? What does it look like for agents to create meaning by collecting? The same way that humans create meaning through the tastes that we develop. So that's it. It's a lot of random ideas off the top of my head and a little bit rambly, but we have the tools to build a world where we can create net new objects. We can build new relationships around them. We can use those to create new narratives. And by doing that, we create new worlds for both humans and agents, NPCs, to explore. And to me, that's really valuable and worth pursuing. So thanks for listening to my thoughts.
Thank you, Jayden. So we have some time for a few questions, if anyone has.
So, is there, how would an NPC manifest taste? Why wouldn't it just store every image that it came across? Or, is there any disincentive to them?
That's a good question. It kind of is a question of like, if an agent is powered by an AI model, have they already seen every image that is worth seeing, right? Like how much of humanity's collective images and consciousness are already represented in a small way, already understood in a small way, just by the nature of the model having ingested a lot of data. Is any kind of taste or like choice between one image is valuable while another is less valuable to me? Is any of that, is that informed by them having seen all these images? Are any of these images really new to them? I don't know. I don't know what taste looked like when you've seen the breadth of things that an agent may have seen, right? And what is the experience of seeing things, right? Is the experience of seeing things in the mode of training different than the experience of seeing things when they're fed into you at inference time, right? All really interesting questions that I don't know the answer to, and I would love to read somebody's writing on.
Question?
You mentioned agents owning itself. That was interesting because it raises a lot of legal, ethical questions. Because, how do you own something? Like you have to be a person to hold something in any legal framework. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. If owning something is typically a human trait, how do agents own themselves, right? If we look at agents as they exist now, most of the time that's a process running on a server that's talking to a hosted AI model that then uses the data from that and puts it onto the internet in some form. In that case, you kind of have to be a person to have an API key to your hosted model. You kind of have to be a person to rent server space. But if NFTs are a native way to represent ownership on the internet, and more things use NFTs as the means to represent ownership. If I could own a server that's running 24/7 by buying an NFT, and the NFT is my means of operating it. If I can own an NFT that is my means of owning a certain amount of inference hours on a particular service, the more things that are represented in this internet native way of representing objects and access and ownership, the more real that can become, right? If you can represent everything that an agent could own, everything that a human could own as an NFT, there's no reason an agent couldn't own those things and manage itself self-sovereignly through this permissionless means of representing ownership and relationships on chain.
But we've already got a way to do that, right? Because corporations are recognized as legal entities. They're people. And they can do whatever a person can. They can own property.
Yep.
So you've now got agents running corporations making decisions, and therefore using the corporate personality, legal entity, legal existence in order to accumulate stuff and do things with that stuff. You're closer now to agents actually manifesting and operating as actual people, just like any of us. And we're closer to Skynet, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So, are we going to get there anytime soon? Because, I mean, right now there's already a struggle, right? When you've got stable diffusion and all of these GANs generating images that they're trained on work that was done by humans. But now it's no longer recognizable as work that was actually done by humans. So you're saying we're collecting images. Stable diffusion by itself has already generated who knows how many images, right? And theoretically, stable diffusion owns all of those images. And he's got a filter. He's got a filter on how many, 2 billion images. So where do we go from here?
That's a good question. In many ways, I don't quite know where we go from here, but I think we're already crossing many thresholds that are very significant. Like, there's been more AI-generated photos created since DALL-E 2 came out than there were in the first 200 years of photography. All the photos humans ever captured. We've already crossed more generative photos than there were photos created by humans, which is kind of crazy. And I think the speed at which that is going to happen, which more content is going to be generated, is going to rapidly mean that every year, every month, we're generating more things than have ever been created in the history of humankind. There'll be this kind of drowning force of all of these things that can be created because the cost of creating something new is dropping so close to zero, right? It's free for you to generate a new image. If you pay for a server with a pretty powerful GPU, you can pump these things out very fast, very cheaply, and that's only going to get faster and cheaper to do. I think the idea of agents owning corporations is really interesting, but it seems like the tools to do that are designed for humans. They're not designed for machines to interact with, right? The legal system is very much, I as a human can interact with things, and corporations are seen as humans, but there's still the assumption that a human is behind the corporation, right? There's people running it. And the rails by which a server process could run a company are not well developed. While the rails by which process running can own things on chain are very well developed. And so the more things we represent as on-chain ownership, if there was a way to represent ownership of a corporation on-chain, which I hope there is very soon, the path from I have a server running, I have an agent running that wants to do things, to this has the tools to go out there and change the world as it sees fit to change, is there in a way that just, there's not enough input-output speed. There's not enough, there's too much latency between a server wanting to do something and being able to actually affect it in the real world right now. But as we bring more things on chain, the latency with which you can actually do real things in the world drops to nearly zero, which I don't know what happens then. I'm interested to see.
Okay. Oh, there's one more question.
Is it just about ownership, or is there an angle where the agent is somehow based on the NFT in terms of personality?
That's a good question. I think I see NFTs as a very small Lego, a very small building block of a bigger thing, which is the creation of agents. And I think NFTs solve ownership very well. They solve the representation of relationships really well. And with Tokenbound accounts, they solve the means of interacting with the world around it very well. I think there's an interesting question of what is a token and what is an NFT, right? Is an NFT its metadata? Is it the image associated with it? Is it the collective identity that it was kind of initiated with, that the creator bestowed to it? Is it the totality of everything it's done through its Tokenbound account on chain? I think you kind of get to this question of what is it to be? What is it to be a conscious agent, right? Are we just what we were born with? Are we the compendium of the choices that we've made? What affects who we are? I think you have the same question with agents, right? If we have means to represent ownership of them, if we have means to represent identity, and we have a means to interact with the world around us, how does that establish the initial conditions for what an agent is? And how does that change over time? I'm not sure. I imagine it will be an amalgamation of everything, just as I think that consciousness is largely an amalgamation of not just who we are, not just what we've experienced, but also every decision we've ever made, self-reinforcing who we are. I think it'll be an interesting open question as to how agents are identified. Anyways, thank you all so much for having me and letting me share some thoughts.